Malaysia's largest state goes to the polls next month for the first time under new Prime Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob. Sarawak will vote on December the 18th. That's less than a month after Mr. Ismail Sabri's Barisan Nasional stormed to a landslide election victory in Malacca. Incumbent GPS party, that's a key ally of BN in the federal government, is expected to win big. And that could fuel more speculation that a general election could be called soon. Like Malacca, the polls will take place under strict COVID-19 curbs. Afifa Arifin with more.
Now, it has been a very eventful timeline, as we know. The state's government mandate had ended in June this year, but the election was postponed due to a 6-month emergency proclamation, which was supposed to last from August until February 2022. But that emergency was dissolved on November 3rd, paving the way for elections to take place within a period of 2 months. Now, with about 1.2 million voters and 82 seats at stake, Sarawak is the biggest state election and is therefore a lot more challenging logistically, especially since it's being held during a pandemic, which had already claimed more than 1,500 lives in Sarawak alone. In the state, some 75% of the population had already been fully vaccinated, and about another 400,000 individuals there had already received the booster dose. The Election Commission today did not reveal the SOPs for the state election, but Law Minister Wan Junaidi had earlier said that the SOPs for Sarawak would take into account the feedback on the effectiveness of the SOPs that were implemented during the Malacca elections last week. The main guideline set by the Elections Commissions in Malacca was that there was no physical or conventional campaign could be held during that campaigning period to reduce the risk of COVID-19 infections. The Health Ministry had also said that there was no politically related public gatherings were allowed. So local politicians from both sides of the divide this time, they are calling for more relaxed measures and SOPs in Sarawak. And that's because they said the SOPs in Malacca would be very impractical to implement in Sarawak because some of the constituencies there are located in very remote and isolated areas where there's limited access to the internet and other forms of electronic media. Many politicians are still hoping that house-to-house campaigning will be permitted, and the opposition politicians in Sarawak have called on the Commission to discuss the SOPs with all political parties first to avoid any sort of unfairness.
Dr. Oh Ee-sun from the Singapore Institute of International Affairs explains why this election will be closely watched ahead of national polls widely expected next year.
It is overdue for almost half a year. And number two, it is yet another testing ground as to the strengths of, well, in this particular case, the various coalitions of political parties in Sarawak. So recently, for example, there were a lot of arguments and calls for revisiting the Malaysia Agreement and so on. So this particular election would indeed to bring those issues to the fore. Well, of course, in Sarawak, the economic development or socio-economic well-being has always been a very important issue. It is the largest state in Malaysia, and then, for example, it has a lot of very remote regions. Whether these regions would indeed get to enjoy the fruits of Malaysia's development, I think indeed the voters will very much like to make a judgment of that. And of course, the federal ruling coalition is affiliated with the Sarawak state ruling coalition. Would the voters like to see this sort of arrangement going forward in the coming years?